Hello folks, this is the recording or the animation of the PowerPoint that we would have gone through in class on August 28th, and I'm posting it for you in this class for today. Quick review of where we were the other day. We talked about David Easton's idea that there are essentially three ways that a leader or government establishes power. He said that it can be done through force, it can be done through rewards, or through legitimacy. Now, force was just physical violence or the credible threat of physical violence. Not angry words, none of that. Rewards was the payment or manipulation of benefits for good behavior as seen by the leader, withholding those benefits or rewards for bad behavior as seen by the leader, and getting people to do things that you want them, if you're the leader, to do by controlling a benefit or reward that they desire. The legitimacy was an establishing in the minds of the followers a belief or an acceptance that the leader has the moral right to be the leader, to rule. That as a follower, I have the moral obligation to follow. Why? Because I accept the leader's right to rule. And therefore, what the leader tells me to do, I need to do because it's the right thing to do. It's also sometimes called authority. Legitimacy and authority are very similar. Now, we briefly reviewed the consequences of force by doing a hypothetical in class with just force only. And of course, we get the resentment, the hostility, the sabotage, the instability, the idea that force as a mechanism of power, while it may be necessary sometimes, when overused, does not lead to stability, is costly, is unstable. We talked about rewards, and we hypothetically set up a classroom where everything that I tried to get you to do was based on manipulating something you desired, a successful grade and a check mark on your transfer protocol without any legitimacy, without any force. And we looked at some of the consequences there. It wasn't as unstable as force, didn't generate as much hostility, but had its own problems: cost, monitoring costs, the idea that it's unstable because the rewards themselves lose their value, reward inflation, or because we run out of rewards and then it's a problem. The system is all bankrupt. So legitimacy, the third source of power, it happens when the leader establishes within the minds of his or her followers a belief that I, the leader, have the moral right to rule, and therefore you as a follower are obligated, required by duty or moral obligation to follow. Leaders, of course, like this. It's really valuable for them. Legitimacy can be established in lots of different ways. A secular leader can establish legitimacy. People believe in that government for whatever reason, or that leader. It can happen in religions. It happens in families. When a mother says, because I'm your mother and I said so, and that's enough for a child to believe that this is something I should do, then that mother has established legitimacy. Now, legitimacy is the holy grail for political leaders. It's what they want. In legitimacy, so we'll imagine the classroom environment, like what we did with both force and rewards. In a classroom environment, we'll in our imaginary scenario here, we will eliminate force completely. There is no violence, no threat of violence ever. We'll also eliminate rewards. There is nothing you want that I can give you. You don't want anything from the class. Now, I still want to get you to learn the material from the class. We assume you really don't want to, but for whatever reason, you were in the class, and because you're in the class, you have accepted the idea that as a member of this class, it is your moral obligation to do what the teacher says. Because along the way, when your mother or your auntie took you to class as a kindergartner kid, she told you, I want you to do what the teacher says and be a good kid, because that's what good kids do. And you believed her, and that has now translated to our class here. Now, in this scenario, if you buy that completely, really buy it, then whatever I tell you to do, you feel obligated to do it because that's what a good person does. So I could conceivably say, hey, I'm busy right now. I need to leave, but here is an article I want you to read. Please read it. It should take you about 20 minutes. In 20 minutes, I want you to get together in groups and discuss it. I'm not going to check on it with any quiz or anything later. I am not going to make you write about it. I am not going to do anything to reward you for it, but this is the assignment. Read and then have a discussion and then leave when the class time is over. Okay, then I walk out the door. Now, in the real world, of course, if there's no accountability, no task, no points tied to it, you'd all leave within 30 seconds of me leaving. But in real legitimacy, if we really bought that, I could give you those instructions, leave, and you would do your best to fulfill the assignment. Even though I wasn't here, and even though there was no reward. That's legitimacy. Now, legitimacy, as you can imagine, is the ideal. It is the holy grail for political leaders. It's what they want. When we have legitimacy fully established, the leader gets obedience on the part of the followers without any monitors, without any payment, without any threats, without any enforcement. People tend to develop a strong sense of loyalty and respect for the leader. It is super low cost for the leader. It's what every political leader wants to accomplish. It is efficient. It is stable. Any political organization that is efficient and stable ultimately has established some form of legitimacy. Otherwise, they wouldn't be efficient and stable. In the classroom, I would pause here and have you turn to a neighbor and talk about what you can already see about the scary, negative, troublesome consequences of legitimacy, particularly legitimacy in an extreme form. So I want you to think about that for just a moment or two. You can pause the recording if you'd like. Think about it, maybe write down a couple of ideas. Now I'm going to go ahead and move on. Some of the things that I wanted to be sure you got as we would talk about if we were in class. The idea that with legitimacy there is always, always, always the potential of abuse of power. This is true in any form of government. In recent weeks, in fact, in the last several years, we've seen a major religious organization running into a lot of humiliation, a lot of trouble because some very small percentage of its leaders have been abusing their role as religious leaders in ways that harmed children. Right? There is that potential. This happens in every organization. The followers potentially become victims. You get the potential of corruption. We've had in the paper in the last little bit politicians and people working within politics being charged with major acts of corruption, siphoning off money out of campaign funds, violating finance rules, all sorts of things. There's the potential of corruption, and people get away with it because the followers accept them as leaders and just follow it. Now, when these things happen, that can seriously undermine the legitimacy of the whole government, certainly of the individual leaders. But it is a potential problem. Anytime you have significant amounts of legitimacy, followers are put at risk for abuse. Now, one of the major goals of the Constitution, of our system of government, is trying to establish legitimacy and then trying to, within the system, that establishes legitimacy also create checks or barriers to these forms of abuse and corruption. So that's a major part of what's going on in the U.S. Constitution. We'll come back to that later. Now, in every real political group, from a family up through the government of a country, there is some form of, some combination of force, rewards, and legitimacy. Most real organizations involve some element of all three. All of them have a significant degree of legitimacy if they're going to endure for any length of time. Legitimacy is really important. Now, legitimacy is really crucial. It's the holy grail for political leaders. It's what they desire more than anything. And that legitimacy, while it's effective, has to be carefully constrained, or you're going to get abuse almost every time. So you got to figure out some way to establish legitimacy and then constrain it. Again, the core idea of the U.S. Constitution. Now, making sure we understand the stuff we're dealing with so far, I want you to hypothetically imagine this scenario, and the question is, what's the source of power? So, a boss yells and screams and threatens, says, I will fire you if that tattoo ever shows again. Cover your dang tattoo or you're fired. Now, what source of power is she trying to exercise? We talked about the three. Okay, make a choice. Did you choose rewards? Now, if you didn't, you probably chose force, and that's because I had her using strong, threatening language. But what is she actually doing? Did she threaten violence? Did she say, I will cut your arm off with that tattoo, get rid of that tattoo? Did she say, I will drive you out with a whip? No, she said, you're fired. I will take away a benefit you presumably want, the benefit of gainful employment. Okay, rewards. Oops. This one is the authority or legitimacy. She is telling the child, your teacher is an authority figure. It's your job to comply with what the teacher tells you. She's trying to establish the idea of legitimacy in the mind of, whoops. It's about force, right? The mafia boss is saying, you will die a gruesome death. In other words, I'll have you killed painfully if you violate the trust. It's force. And is it credible? Yeah, it's mafia boss, right? They kill people. At least there's our stereotype. Now, I want to move on from Easton's idea about power and look closer at legitimacy. We talked about legitimacy as being important. You know, the idea in the minds of followers that it's my obligation to do what the leader tells me because I accept the leader. The leader is legitimate. Now, another term for that, the individual leader or the government that the leader represents, is seen as having authority. They are a person who can tell us what to do, who appropriately has the right to make decisions for the whole community. Authority. Now, I want to look at the ideas of another scholar who asks the question, how do governments establish authority? And he comes up with 3 different ways. Now, I want to first introduce the scholar. The guy's name was Max Weber. Yes, Max Weber. And I am saying that in a way that is probably not the way you read it. Right? You probably wanted to say Max Weber or Max Weber if you're from Utah. All right, so the reason I'm saying it Max Weber is because the man is a very prominent, historically really significant dead German. He's German. And in Germany, you would say it Max Weber. Now, well-educated people in the United States, really well-educated people, all know Max Weber. And they know he's Max Weber, not Max Weber. Now, later on, when you're in your bachelor's program, or maybe even grad school, but probably bachelor's level, you're going to have an experience in, perhaps it'll be an upper level history class, perhaps it'll be an organizational behavior class in your business program, perhaps it'll be some other business class, some sort of leadership thing, someplace you're going to have this opportunity where you're going to want to share what we're going to talk with about Weber, because you want to look smart for your upper division professor, because that's the person who's going to write letters of recommendation that gets you into a job or grad school, whatever your goal is. So you want to look smart. Well, the professor will be talking about some concept and you go, whoa, the stuff I learned back in Professor Keele's class about Weber would be really really, really cool to share here. And so you're going to share it and you go, hey, professor, I think Max Weber's ideas about authority is relevant here. And you blah, 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 and your professor is going to be absolutely impressed. Wow. How does this undergrad know about Weber? Because we don't teach Weber to undergrads. By the way, the reason we don't teach Weber to undergrads is because he's a dead German, which means he wrote in German, which means the stuff we have accessible to us is translated from the German, and it's really hard to read because German literature just is that way. Their sentences are ungodly long and complicated, and when it gets translated, it always is obtuse, complicated. Now, his ideas aren't that complicated, but the translations often are. So I'm not going to make you read Weber, but I do want to talk about him. But anyway, in that context, when you say to your professor, wouldn't Max Weber's ideas, blah, 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 and the professor is going to be a little confused. Wow, this is a brilliant student. How does this student know about Weber already? And how does such a brilliant student who knows about Weber not know how to say it? And so the professor will ask, so that's, say something about, say something like, wow, that's really impressive. Where did you learn about Weber? And you go, I learned it at Porterville College. And then I look stupid because, I didn't teach you how to say it. So please remember Max Weber. All right, going on. Now, Max Weber's most famous work is a piece called The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. It's his most famous piece. It's not the piece I really want to talk about, but I do need to introduce it to you. Because if you act like you know who Weber is and you don't know about the Protestant ethic, then you're going to get caught as not really knowing. So the Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, usually referred to as simply the Protestant Ethic, is his most famous piece. This is a classic piece of social science theory work that tries to explain a major social phenomena from a cultural perspective. So his thesis, his question is, why do we get capitalism, read Industrial Revolution, Capitalist Revolution, why do we get capitalism emerge in Northern Europe and not anywhere else in the world? When in fact, Southern Europe was richer at the time, more advanced in many ways. Even Asia was more advanced in many ways. Why does it happen in Northern Europe? And his explanation has a whole lot to do with cultural, even religious ideas. So here's the basic argument in a nutshell. It's a really simple caricature, but it works. It should work for you. So here's the idea. Weber says, Northern Europeans are the ones that led us into capitalism, largely because Northern Europeans were Protestant, not Catholic or any other religion. And in particular, they were Protestant and were influenced by a tradition of John Calvin. Calvin included in his Protestant theology a concept called predestination, the doctrine of predestination. In this doctrine of predestination, we're all destined either to go to heaven and be saved with God, or to go to hell and be damned and burn in hell forever. And it has absolutely nothing to do with any choices we make or anything we do or don't do. It has everything to do with the inscrutable knowledge and wisdom of God, which we can't possibly understand or do anything about. So we're all already either saved or damned. Hallelujah, glory be to God. Okay, that was a caricature. That's a nutshell version. And Weber says that as a major idea in Northern Europe leads to the Industrial Revolution. That sounds a little crazy, so here's the way it works. That's the doctrine of predestination. At the mass level, at the popular level, not the level of priests and scholars, but the level of ordinary working folks. They get this idea of predestination. They understand a little bit of it. They kind of don't understand a lot of it, but they kind of come to this conclusion that, if God loves us and has already decided who's damned or saved, he's probably going to intervene and maybe help out those that are saved already. God will prosper those he loves. So, and the way they see that is God will prosper those he loves by, making them rich. So if I get rich, that's a really good sign that God loves me. If I'm extremely poor, then, that probably means I'm one of the damned. Now, nobody wants to be one of the damned. Everybody wants to be saved. And while Calvin would say, hey, there's nothing you can do about it, for your ordinary worker, poorly educated, not really understanding Calvin very well, who gets this idea that, God maybe prospers those that he loves. If I can get rich, that would be a sign that God loves me, and I would know that I'm saved. So, this is, by the way, not Calvin would have hated that idea, but it comes to be a common understanding. So, if you are a laboring class person or a potential would-be new business owner in this environment, you want your business to succeed. You want your efforts to succeed. You want to get rich, not just because you want to get rich, but because you want to know you're saved. And so they are likely to try and get rich. Now, in any context, in any place, in any time in history, one of the ways a person gets ahead is by being really smart and working really, really hard. Now, there's never been a time or place in history where everyone who's smart and works hard succeeds. But in every system, economic and political, people who are smart and hardworking are going to be more likely to get ahead than those who are lazy and stupid. Okay, so you get people motivated to work hard in hopes that they can discover that God loves them and they're saved. Now, some number of people who put a little extra effort in, motivated by the hope of salvation, are going to succeed. Now, here's some other quirks about the Calvinist interpretation of Christian theology. Within Calvinism, among the deadly sins is the sin of vanity or pride. And vanity and pride are most visible, most noticeable when a person is showy, when a person engages in what later people would call conspicuous consumption. Furs, fancy clothes, jewelry, big showy houses, big showy carriages. That's a mortal sin. This is how you get ideas like the Pilgrims and others, where even as you're successful, you keep yourself looking modest and humble with brown and black and basic things, nothing showy. To get showy is to demonstrate that you're guilty of a mortal sin of vanity. Well, some number of these people that work hard are successful, but they don't want to demonstrate that they're vain by expanding the house, by getting a bigger carriage, by putting their wife in furs, by buying jewelry. Oh, you can't do all that stuff because that's a mortal sin. Okay, so what do you do with your extra money? Well, you could give it to the poor. And if you're a good Catholic, you'd have done a lot of that because Catholics have always been taught to take care of other people. They're great at that kind of community stuff. But that's not the idea of Calvinist Protestantism. If people are poor and suffering, it's because they are lazy and sinful. And extraordinary generosity, that's just rewarding bad behavior. You don't do that. We hear that kind of ideas among some of our circles today. But anyway, so they're not going to spend it on themselves, on luxuries. They're not going to give it away in charity, at least not in excessive amounts. So what do you do with it? Well, typically, what's left is you plow it back into your business. Now, in the modern world, any business that really wants to grow, one of the things that one of the standard formulas is plow a significant amount of your profits back into the company, reinvest. If you read any self-help book on how to die rich, The Richest Man in Babylon, Rich Dad, Poor Dad, Rich on Any Income, The Millionaire Next Door, any of these how to get rich kinds of books, they almost all have the same formula. And the formula is develop some valuable skill, work really hard, and always, always, always live on less money than you make, no matter how much that is. Always, always, always save at least 10%, even while you're in training or in your internship or in school. And then invest that savings wisely in something that produces income itself or produces wealth itself. Okay, so these guys aren't investing in the stock market, but they turn their money, their extra money, back into their own business. And well, if they're already making a profit, that generally means their business idea, whatever it is they're doing, is a good one. And their management skills are good, so they're reinvesting in a well-run firm. And it grows like crazy, and voila, you get the industrial capitalist revolution, and Northern Europe becomes wealthy and dominates the rest of the world for 100 and some odd years. Okay, that's Weber's argument. Now, that's the Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism. Is this the truth? Who knows? It's a plausible, scientifically structured argument trying to explain a significant historical phenomenon using scientific approaches and cultural variables as the explanation. It's a classic piece of good social science research or study or theory. Now, just like theory or research results in the biological or physical sciences, neither Weber nor any other serious social scientist would ever claim that's truth, it's fact. No biologist would claim their current theory of biology is fact. No. Science and scientific method, whether it be in the social sciences or in the biological or physical sciences, is a constant effort through rational processes to try to discover deeper and greater levels of truth. A real scientist in any field constantly keeps his or her mind open to the likelihood that what looks at the moment like established fact might in fact be a step towards greater knowledge as we learn more. But anyway, in the social sciences, we never claim that what we think we explain is absolute, and Weber certainly didn't. So the Protestant ethic is this classic piece, and I share this with you because if you know about Weber, you need to know about the Protestant ethic, and someday when you're on Jeopardy and you make it to Final Jeopardy, and the final question is, who is the great German social scientist who wrote the famous book, The Protestant Ethic and Spirit of Capitalism, you're going to jump up and down and thank Professor Keele and answer the question with, who is Max Weber? And you're going to say it Max Weber because otherwise you will embarrass yourself and me too. Alrighty, so Weber, what I want to really talk about, Weber's famous in sociology of religion, in economics, in government studies, particularly international and comparative politics studies. But what I want to talk about with Weber is his approach to authority. Looks pretty authoritative there in that picture, doesn't he? Well, anyway, his approach to authority. Weber says he's taking, we had, the same concept that Easton was talking about with legitimacy. This belief by the part of the followers that the leader and the government has a right to be our leader, has a right to set up our rules, and we accept them because, well, they have that right. And because they have that right that we accept, we will obey them. Why? Because it's the right thing to do. It's our moral obligation. So Weber says that there are essentially three ways that governments establish that kind of relationship with their followers. First, the one he was most excited about that I'm going to introduce first is one that he calls rational legal. Now, many of you, as you write about this later, are going to want to shorten it and call it just rational. or call it just legal. And either way, you're wrong. Please don't. It's rational legal, both words. It's not hyphenated. Rational legal. Okay, so rational legal authority is one. This one's modern. This one's new. This is what he was excited about. At his time in the world, he said, this is new in the world and it's going to change everything. The other type, one that was more common, the ordinary, the normal, what's been going on forever and ever and ever, he called traditional. And the third type is rare and always, always, always destabilizing, revolutionary. He called it charismatic. Now, rational legal authority. This is the one that I'm going to focus the most on. It's the one that's modern. It's the one that Weber was excited about. It's the one that you and I know in our everyday life, in all of our public sphere, is rational legal. This is modern authority. It is authority based on rules and processes. It is authority where, well, it's typified by bureaucracy. Bureaucrats do not make decisions based on their preferences. They follow rules. They apply rules and protocols and procedures, and that's how decisions get made in bureaucracies. That's classic rational legal. Rational legal is another way of saying the rule of law, where you have laws, the laws are clear, even the leader is subject to the law, and nobody gets to do anything by whim. Rational legal. Now, Weber says this type of authority is exciting and new. We'll come back to that in a minute. The type that he was more familiar with, that was more typical of his time, he called traditional. This would be old Europe. This is the idea of the reign of kings. The king is the king because his father was the king, because his father was the king, because his father was the king. It is authority. It is inherited. The lord of the manor is the lord of the manor because his father was the lord of the manor, and so on. This is authority that is that lands on a person, or that a person is able to claim because of an accident of biology. They're the oldest surviving heir of the previous authority figure. Perhaps the oldest surviving heir of the correct gender. Sometimes male, sometimes female, depending on the situation. It is authority granted by an accident of biology. And because of that accident of biology, you were born in the right birth order, or at least you survived all your older siblings. They died before you did. You have that authority. Okay, now, the next one is charismatic. This one is really unusual. It is absolutely special. It's always, always, always revolutionary. It turns the world upside down. It is never the government of a long-running, stable society. This is what happens in revolutions or something like that. This is based on the followers' acceptance or belief that that leader is somehow or other superhuman, somehow or other special, somehow or other way beyond the pale of human capability. Okay, it is not just that they're really talented or anything like that. We'll come back to that in a little bit. So the three steps. Now I want to start with rational legal first. It's the one we are most familiar with. This is authority that is established. The leader is selected by some sort of process. The graphic I have here is the beginning of the United States Constitution, right? A process set up by the Constitution, a set of rules we accept as the fundamental basis for our government, and decisions made under that process, under those rules, we accept as binding. Leaders elected under those rules we accept as legitimate, as having authority, even if we voted for the other guy. Okay, so it's sometimes called procedural authority. Elections are a classic example of it. Even at lower levels of government where it's not an election, where they're just hired, this kind of authority, in this kind of situation, even the hirelings have to go through a process. If you want to work for the post office and you think you got an in because your favorite uncle is the postmaster in our system, you're going to have a rude awakening. In traditional authority, sure, your uncle could bring you in, but in rational legal, your uncle can't hire you unless or until you go through the process and come out on top of the process. You would have to take the postal version of the civil service exam. You would have to score very, very well so that you're in the very limited pool of people from whom the postmaster can select people to interview. Then, because you're the nephew or niece, your uncle, the postmaster, would have to inform others that my nephew or niece is in the pool. and is a well-qualified candidate, he or she will be among the candidates. And they will then bring in other people to make sure that the uncle or is not hiring you based on preferences. Process, process, process. Rules, rules, rules. There's rules for everything. There are rules for making rules. There are rules for every decision we do. We have rules for a trial. How do we determine whether a person is guilty or innocent? How do we determine whether we even can put them on trial? What qualifies as legitimate evidence, what doesn't? Rules and processes for everything. We have rules and processes for earning a degree. You may well be the most brilliant person who ever set foot on this campus. You may take lots of classes, almost every class on the campus, and get the highest score in the history of the institution. But if you don't take the right classes, if, for example, in your 300 units at Porterville College, you never bothered yourself to take American Government, Poli-Sci 101, or Colonial U.S. History, History P117, or Modern U.S. History, P118, History 118. If you don't take at least one of those three, you never get an associate degree from Porterville College. Because those three in combination they're the only courses offered in one category. It's the American Institutions requirement, and you've got to have that, or you can't graduate. Process, process, rules, rules. Everything has a rule. We have rules for making rules. Congress has to follow its own process to make new laws, to change the laws. We do change laws regularly. We have rules for whether or not who can get married to one another, who can't, when. And we sometimes have processes of changing those rules. We have rules for absolutely everything. Now I want you to think about, for a minute, normally I would have you turn to a neighbor, but think about some place that I haven't given as an example where you deal with decisions made through processes or with leaders who are there because of rational legal authority. Think about it for a minute and we'll come back. Now I would normally have you repeat or return. I would normally have you return and report. The DMV, banks, any permit you want from the city. There are all sorts of places where you would run into that. Anything in the public sphere in America is always rational legal. Now, rational legal authority is special in some really important ways. Rational legal authority has clear boundaries. The authority has clear parameters. A leader may have enormous power and authority. The President of the United States, for example, can commit our nation to a battle by sending troops into a country that was our best ally yesterday. And we invade. And the President can do that all by himself. Now, then with the consent of Congress, he can make that an official war. And then with the consent of Congress, he may very well invoke the draft. And if you happen to be male and of the right age, you could get drafted, even though you think that's the stupidest war on the planet. And then you are then legally bound to go and fight for the country or spend time in jail instead. Or he has enormous authority there. Now, all of it with boundaries. He can get you killed, in other words, for something you think is stupid. But the president can't say, you will go to church this Sunday, or you won't. The president can't say, you're going to marry this person. The president can't say, you are going to earn this degree, and this is going to be your job. The president has no authority in that realm. His authority is clearly bounded. A president's authority is bounded in time. No president gets to serve more than 10 years. 8 years. Then they're done. Okay. It's limited in context. It's limited in time. It is the relationship between the follower and the leader is very specific and very bounded. Within the classroom environment, within the context of your American government class that you're taking right now, I have a lot of authority. Our relationship as professor and student in that relationship, I have a lot of authority. But the authority has very clear, specific boundaries. You totally know that I can assign reading. I can just make you do writing. I can have you do presentations. I can pick what I have you read and what I have you write and what kind of presentations and how I test you. But the minute I say you need to come and mow my lawn as part of this class, you know right up front that that's not within my scope of authority. I don't have authority for that. I can't tell you what church to go to, whom you may or may not hang out with. So there is a limited context, a limited time, limited to a specific range of action. It is bounded. Clear boundaries. Now, that means, well, there are fewer opportunities for abuse. Now, some good things about rational legal authority. It's predictable. You know what the rules are in advance. You know who the decision makers are in advance. You know what their boundaries and authority is. It's predictable. You know who's what. You know what are the rules. It's orderly. It's transparent. You know in advance. All people are equal before the law. Now, in the real world, of course, people apply those rules, and sometimes they apply the rules differently based on their own preferences or prejudices, but that violates the rules itself. So that's the system opens up the opportunity to correct those things. It is a situation where it does better than any other system at protecting the followers from being abused. If I try to turn you into my personal lawn care service as part of this class, you know from the beginning that's outside the scope of my authority, and you have a recourse to refuse. If the president tries to turn a person into his personal servant, his sex slave, whatever, the person knows the president doesn't have that authority. There are mechanisms to protect that person. Whereas in earlier forms of authority, in traditional, kings could do those kinds of things. Their authority was not clearly bounded or specified. This kind of authority, not perfectly, but better than any other type, protects the rights and the autonomy of subordinates, of the followers. Now, rational legal authority is a really exciting one. Weber loved it. It's got lots of strengths. It's not perfect. There are some problems. I have the graphic here with the bureaucracy and the window closed. Okay, we all love bureaucracy, right? Your favorite thing in the world is when you get to go to the DMV and renew your driver's license or register a new vehicle, or we love to go to the DMV, right? Okay, well, because, well, it's bureaucracy. And bureaucracy is a classic example of rational legal authority. Processes, because everything has to go through a process, it's slow, it's rigid, it's inflexible. It takes too much time. Oh my goodness, what if you fill out the form just a little bit wrong? And then you get to start over. It's cold, it's impersonal. All the things that we hate about bureaucracy. These are all side effects, negative consequences of rational legal authority. Sometimes the rules and the processes themselves get in the way of the goal. The goal of Porterville College, its only reason for existence is to help you develop skills and knowledge in ways that are verifiable with certificates and degrees, so that you can gain new knowledge and skills, and then convince other people you have those with your certificate so that you can move on in your career or your education. That's all we exist for. We don't exist for anything else. And yet, some of our processes sometimes seem to get in the way. Our registration processes. So, if you register, you go to all great lengths to make sure you get high enough priority so that you can get into that class that's always full. Maybe it's a chemistry class, maybe it's an anatomy class, and it's always full. And you go through all the work and you get yourself there on priority. You get in the class, And then something happens, some sort of glitch. Maybe you forget to do the paperwork exactly right. Maybe you forget to send the check. Maybe it gets lost in the mail. Maybe someone else makes the mistake. But in any case, the payment isn't processed in time. Well, if the payment isn't processed in time, which is 10 days after you register, the computer may very well automatically drop you. And then by the time you realize it, you go to add back in and you're number 352 on the wait list. And you're not getting in. Okay, that doesn't help anybody, right? But it's part of our process. Now, there are reasons for that process. Students, if they don't have to pay, will often register for far more classes than they intend to take. And then we get to the end and a whole bunch of folks that were in the class suddenly drop. Maybe we added a bunch of sections because it looked like there were lots of people on it, and then a whole bunch of them drop. Yeah. So requiring people to pay early is a way to make sure that the people who are on the roster actually intend to take the class. So there are reasons for that, but it sometimes gets in the way. Sometimes you get really stupid outcomes. Sometimes, for example, if the cops make an error in their gathering of evidence, they don't get the warrant that they should have, whatever, the damning evidence, the proof that a person is committed some particular heinous crime, maybe it's murder, that proof is inadmissible because it was gathered illegally, and a guilty murderer gets off on a technicality. Now, we all hate that, and it does, in fact, happen sometimes. Not as often as you would think, as much as we hear about it, but it does sometimes happen. We all hate that. So rational legal authority is not perfect. Sometimes there are quick, easy answers that everyone can agree to, but they get blocked because, well, they're outside the process. Okay, so making sure you understand. So in a typical American trial to determine whether a defendant is guilty or not guilty of a crime, that would be a good example of rational legal authority. What would you say, true or false? Okay, this is absolutely true. It's all about process, rules. The judge's job is to make sure we follow the rules in determining guilt or innocence. Now, before we leave rational legal authority, to be sure, again, to be emphatic about it, it's typical of modern democratic governments. No government can really be a democracy unless its authority type fits with Weber's rational legal category. They're the same thing in some respects. Now, you don't have to be a democracy to be rational legal, but if you're really a democracy, it's rational legal. There's a focus in these kinds of governments on process, more than outcomes. The process emphasizes equality. Everyone should be treated equally before the law. It is great, or at least better than any other system, at protecting us from abuse, but it's also excruciatingly slow and frustrating. All right, next concept. I want to talk about the next type of authority, traditional authority. This is the type of authority, again, that is inherited. A person has authority because they inherit it or because they simply do. Leaders become leaders because they're leaders. Well, they're leaders because they inherited it in some way. The European concept of the divine right of kings is a classic example of traditional authority. In simpler old world communities, tribal villages, they almost all had a council of tribal elders who became the elders by being the oldest members of the community, the oldest males in each clan, the oldest female in each clan, whatever. They all had something to do with an accident of biology, being the right birth order or the right age. It's all about biological accident. You get Old Testament Israel, we had hereditary lines of priesthood, hereditary lines of kings. Now, in traditional authority, there are always or almost always patterns of inheritance, father to son, mother to daughter, parents to oldest child. It might also be oldest surviving member of each of the genealogical lines, each of the families within our village. It might be everybody over 60. There are all sorts of things, but they almost always have something to do with biology. There are patterns of inheritance, patterns of transition. The transitions from the last leader to the new leader are really stable. I read a novel a while back. Fun novel based in a futuristic China, or at least the particular scene is futuristic China. And we have an emperor dying of a horrible contagious disease behind a containment field. His young son, 17, 18-year-old son, is standing outside the containment field watching through the glass as his father passes. And the old emperor's trusted long-term advisor, vizier, whatever you want to call him, is standing next to the emperor's son, the prince. And the old emperor passes away. He dies. The advisor, with a tear in his eyes, says, "The emperor is dead. Long live the emperor." Now that sounds really bizarre, right? The emperor is dead. Long live the emperor. Now, think of it this way. The emperor is dead, he says, as he looks through the glass at the corpse of the dead emperor. Then he turns to the prince, the son of the now dead emperor, drops to one knee, facing the son of the emperor, and says, "Long live the emperor." Okay, bang, transition, right? Dad breathed his last death, now you're emperor. Done. Now, there would, of course, be ceremonies and everything to celebrate that, but the transition was stable. Nobody would doubt that. Nobody would question, because we know what it is. So it's not, I'll come back to that in a second. Okay, that's traditional authority. Okay, making sure you get it. A proposition here. Milt Stowe, the current mayor of Porterville, California, could be described reasonably as exercising traditional authority when he leads the city government. Okay, that's a proposition. I would have you discuss it, but you're probably alone, so think it through. What would your answer be? Is that true or false? And why? Okay. So, the questions you need to ask, right? Did he get in that position through a process or by inheritance, by a biological accident? Well, he's elected through a process. Okay. That makes it not traditional but rational legal. Is his authority unbounded? Can he order anything without limits of members of the city? Or is it clearly bounded? Are there clear parameters that he can use within where his authority exists, and lots of areas where it doesn't? Yeah, okay. So it's definitely not rational legal, not traditional, excuse me. Definitely not traditional. He didn't inherit it. It's not unbounded. It is, well, process, and clear specific limits and boundaries. It's rational legal. So the answer here, it would be false. It's rational legal. Now, traditional authority, it's old school. It's not what we're accustomed to. Our ancestors in the United States largely abandoned it. But it's not inherently evil, necessarily. It has its strengths. Traditional authority is stable and orderly. You know who the leader is. We know who makes the call. We know what the succession pattern is. It's orderly. It can be really flexible. You never get one of those silly outcomes where everybody knows the person's guilty, but because the cops made an error in collecting evidence, we can't use it, so he's going to walk. Not in traditional authority. The leader doesn't have to deal with that. You're not going to be bound by silly procedural norms. The person's guilty. We will hold them responsible. We have an easy outcome that everybody likes. Okay, it's not normal, but we're going to go ahead and do it. We can do that in traditional authority. People tend to really feel strongly about their traditional authority figures. They love the king. You can have a good outcome that is just right and make it work regardless of rules or all that. Right, good, doesn't get blocked by process. Now there are potential problems. Who determines what's right and good? By what criteria? It's just the king or the leader, whoever the leader is. The leader's perspective is the only one that matters. On almost everything, there are multiple perspectives on what's right and wrong, what's good or bad. But only one person's perspective matters, the leader. This kind of authority can be, I said it was stable, but it can also be fickle. We do deal with traditional authority in our modern world in one realm of our lives, and that's in the family. Right? Within a family context, the parent figure or parent figures get their role as parent through an accident of biology, right? Happen to have a child. And they don't have to pass some sort of qualification test. The qualification is fertile. Right? And people, men or women, whom you wouldn't even let borrow a dog because they're too incompetent to care for them, may very well have children. And they have tremendous authority over that child. But now, we'll come back to that. In this scenario, the leader determines what's right. Even if it's one person. You all dealt with your mom at some point. You knew if you were asking for something that was maybe a little uncertain, maybe she'll say yes, maybe she'll say no, and you realized she was really pissed at you that day because of, you did something that she was unhappy with. If you asked when she's already angry with you, you know the answer will be no. On the other hand, if it's one of those things where she might go yes, she might go no, and she's in a really great mood because she just got some fabulous news, she's pleased with you because your report card just came back and it was fabulous, you're more likely to get a yes. Okay, you guys all remember that when you were children. Okay? Well, same thing is true for the king. Their mood matters. Or if there are multiple leaders, then which one of them you draw, which judge you draw, makes all the difference. Now, with traditional authority, if the leader is in fact an idiot, is incompetent, there's no peaceful, reasonable way to remove that incompetent leader. Oh, yeah, you can assassinate him. And then you're going to get arrested and executed yourself. Yeah, you can have a rebellion, but people get killed that way. There's no good way, reasonable way, to remove a stupid, incompetent, wicked, mean, cruel, unfair leader. There's also no particular way for exemplary talent, a person born into poverty and obscurity, to rise to high positions of leadership based on super talents. Not in traditional authority patterns. Because those people, they will inherit the roles that they inherit from their parents. The power itself, exercised by an individual leader, can be unrestrained, unlimited. There's really, the potential for abuse is incredible. Kings didn't even consider it abuse to demand sexual favors from subjects. They didn't even think of it as abuse. We would see that as horrible abuse. They wouldn't even see it that way. Because the power is so unrestrained, the potential for abuse is enormous. I have very little potential for the individual. Okay, so making sure we understand it. Saudi Arabia has an hereditary monarchy. Typically, the oldest son of the reigning king becomes the next king and governs for life, with very few limits on his power. Max Weber would classify this as which one would it be? Think about it for a minute. Traditional, right? Accident of biology, relatively unlimited power, traditional authority. Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's father was Prime Minister in the 1970s. Okay. That's true. The Prime Minister of Canada, however, is elected in regularly scheduled elections. So, what type of authority does Prime Minister Trudeau exercise in Canada? Is it charismatic, rational, legal, traditional, royalty, traditional, or is it force? Think about it. Okay. Did he get it by inheritance or by a process? Election, right? That makes it rational, legal.